Why do small businesses often struggle to survive, while large companies can generate billions? Why does Amazon become stronger with every new customer? Netflix serve hundreds of millions of people, while major technology companies often dominate entire markets. And most importantly, why is scale one of the main mechanisms behind the creation of massive wealth? Because in the modern economy, wealth is often created not simply through a good product, but through the ability to scale that product, reduce costs, and increase profits faster than expenses grow. And today, we will explore what the scale effect really is, how economies of scale work, why large companies gain enormous advantages, how the digital economy has made scale almost limitless, and why scale lies at the core of most great fortunes of the modern era. Let's start with the key idea. Scale is the ability to increase output faster than costs increase. It is one of the most important concepts in all of economics. For example, imagine a small coffee shop. If it wants to sell twice as much coffee, it usually needs more employees, more ingredients, more equipment, and more space. In other words, costs grow almost alongside revenue. Now let's look at a digital product. For example, Netflix, Spotify, YouTube, software, AI platforms. Creating the product is expensive, but once it is built, adding one more user costs almost nothing. That is the power of scale. In economics, this is called economies of scale. In simple terms, the larger production becomes, the cheaper each unit of the product gets. And this is critically important. For example, if a factory produces 100 cars, the cost per car is relatively high. But if a factory produces 1 million cars, equipment is used more efficiently, purchasing becomes cheaper, logistics are optimized, technologies pay for themselves, and fixed costs are spread across a massive production volume. As a result, the cost per unit declines. That is why large companies can often sell at lower prices, earn higher profits, and push smaller competitors out of the market. To understand scale, you first need to understand the difference between two types of costs. Fixed costs. These are expenses that remain relatively unchanged regardless of output. For example, office space, servers, factories, product development, software infrastructure, and other core expenses. These costs must be paid regardless of how many customers a company has. Variable costs. These are expenses that increase as production grows. For example, raw materials, delivery, packaging, labor costs per unit, and similar operational expenses. And this is where the magic of scale begins. As a company grows, fixed costs are distributed across a larger number of sales. As a result, the average cost of the product falls. That is why major platforms become so profitable and why software businesses can achieve extremely high margins. In the traditional economy, scaling was expensive. Companies had to build stores, factories, logistics systems, and physical infrastructure. But the digital economy changed the rules of the game. Today, one app can serve the entire world. One video can be watched by millions. One AI model can be used globally. And one creator can build an audience larger than traditional TV channels once had. And this created a new economic reality, the near-zero marginal cost economy. In other words, the cost of serving one additional user becomes almost zero. There is an even more powerful mechanism: network effects. This happens when a product becomes more valuable as more people use it. For example, Instagram, TikTok, WhatsApp, Facebook, LinkedIn. If only 10 people use a platform, its value is limited. But when billions of people use it, its value increases dramatically. This creates an economic snowball effect. More users leads to more data, leads to a better product, leads to even more users, leads to more revenue. That is why major platforms are so difficult to compete with. Scale has one important property. Scale creates advantages. When a company becomes large, it gains cheaper access to financing, better technology, access to top talent, lower purchasing costs, a stronger brand, more data, better AI systems, and higher marketing efficiency. and all of this strengthens its position even further. That is why the modern economy often leads to a concentration of capital. In other words, the biggest players accumulate even more power over time. Most of the largest fortunes of the modern era were created through scale. Not because these people worked 1,000 times harder, but because they built systems that serve millions of users, operate globally, and scale almost without limits. For example, software, AI, cloud platforms, e-commerce, media platforms, digital advertising, and operating systems. One product leads to millions of users, which leads to exponential revenue growth. This is how big tech, global digital capitalism, and extreme concentrations of wealth emerge. Not every industry has the same scaling potential. For example, a barber, a dentist, or a local restaurant all face natural limitations. Their income is heavily tied to time, physical presence, and the number of customers they can serve each day. Digital systems, by contrast, can operate 24/7, globally, automatically, and with almost no limits. That is why the modern economy places such high value on software, AI, platforms, media, and intellectual property. Large fortunes are often created when revenue grows faster than costs, and scale is the mechanism that makes this possible. If a person creates something once but can sell it millions of times, economics begins to work very differently. That is why ownership, scale, technology, distribution, and platforms have become the primary sources of great wealth in the 21st century. So, the scale effect is one of the most powerful mechanisms of wealth creation in the modern economy, because scale allows businesses to grow revenue faster than costs, reduce unit costs, strengthen competitive advantages, and build systems that can operate globally. That is why the greatest fortunes of our time are created not simply through labor, but through scalable systems, digital platforms, technology, and the ability to serve massive numbers of people with almost no additional cost. And perhaps the most important economic reality of the 21st century can be summed up like this: those who learn to scale value achieve disproportionately large results.
Subscribe and stay with us. See you in the next videos.